it also distracts the public from the proxy war in Ukraine, where just today, the U.S. announced its biggest shipment of weapons yet, $3 billion. That's more weapons than the U.S. has announced in any single shipment before. And that's what we're not supposed to be talking about. And that is what is really, I think, our biggest danger right now. It's exacerbating the threat of a nuclear disaster, as we're seeing at the nuclear plant in Ukraine, which both sides accuse the other of shelling. I think it's pretty clear, based on the fact that Russia is occupying that plant. The idea that Russia would shell a nuclear plant that it's occupying seems pretty crazy to me, but who knows? Look, regardless, it underscores the need for diplomacy and to end the war. And there's none of that right now. And in fact, it might be too late on the Russian side. Russia might be done trying to talk to the U.S. They had their stated terms for ending the war laid out very clearly before the war and when the war began, and even more than a month into the war. And, this is an overlooked episode. We've talked about it, but it should be stressed. Zelensky put out what looked like a serious plan, a 10-point plan. And there was going to be a Russian-Ukrainian meeting in Turkey in early April. Well, what happened, according to Ukrainian media? Boris Johnson came to Ukraine, obviously acting on behalf of the U.S., because Boris Johnson wouldn't have done this without U.S. orders, and told Zelensky not to negotiate with Putin, and said, if you do negotiate with Putin and you sign any kind of security guarantee, we're not going to join it. So we will not guarantee your security in any kind of resolution with Russia. That is an order for more war. And that's why months later, we're still in it. And the U.S. is announcing billions of dollars in new weapons. And as we talked about on the Democratic side, zero restraining force. Ro Khanna made one little peep once in the Washington Post where he said, he acknowledged that this war is causing global havoc on the economy. It's wreaking havoc on the domestic economy and the global economy. I'm paraphrasing, but that was his message. So Ro Khanna recognized this war is causing global havoc, and he asked, where's the plan for diplomacy?
Right.
There is no plan. And
where was Ro Khanna's plan in the beginning? I mean, I went up and interviewed, and I got it right up in his face and said, what do you think? And he sounded like a Reagan era neocon. He was like, they're fighting for the free world and we need to give them all the weapons and, no, just all the way. We're going to, it was like he was ready to march all the way to Moscow or something. And now he's calling for diplomacy. Yeah, honestly, the time for diplomacy is 2015.
And the thing is, that was also a very brief call for diplomacy, because that was I think 2 months ago now. And that was one little blip from Ro, but he hasn't chimed in since on diplomacy. So he asked, what's the plan? But then he didn't follow up. And of course, there is no plan. And obviously, he just doesn't, Ro just doesn't care, really. And no Democrats do. They seem unconcerned with how disastrous this is. And they seem on board with just shipping off more weapons. And I wanted to show one quote today from the Wall Street Journal, which really captures the dominant mentality right now in Washington. There's a journal article from today talking about how well the war is going for Ukraine. And it says this: widespread evidence of alleged Russian atrocities against Ukrainians and Mr. Putin's weaponization of energy, food, and even nuclear safety have made his regime a pariah throughout the developed world, although not in the global South, where skepticism toward the West runs deep. So the developed world, quote unquote, happens to exclude the majority of the world's population, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and they're not developed because they don't obey the masters in the West, and they're skeptical of the West when it comes to this proxy war in Ukraine.
You can hear those voices in the old colonial propaganda films, like the white man's brain is far more developed than those in the global southern nations who follow the Russian Slavic races in all of their devious disinformation acts. The white man, however, understands that he must make a pariah of the Slav who weaponizes energy, food, and even nuclear safety. As Rudyard Kipling argued. So, yeah, is this an op-ed or was this a report?
That's a news story. It's not even the right wing. That's a news story talking about the developed world and the non-developed world, which is basically the majority of it. And you're going to call it's so colonial and racist, really. But that's what this war is about. It's about reinforcing Western supremacy.
Well, you saw Blinken go to Africa and get humiliated by I should put this footage up. Get humiliated by the South African foreign minister.
Find that's a great example. That this was after the U.S. in the form of UN Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield threatened Africa, said, "Okay, you're allowed to buy certain Russian products. You can buy food, right, and fertilizer. I think that was her allowed Russian products. But she says anything else, if you buy anything else from Russia, you're going to face a consequence. You're going to pay a price. Just outright mob threats against the continent of Africa if they dare follow their own policy towards Russia and buy the basic goods that they need to exist." And the U.S. government felt entitled to threaten Africa if they dared disobey. And so after that, then Blinken goes to South Africa and he gets called on that.
And seek to teach a country that, we know how democracy functions, and we've come to tell you, you do it, it will work for you. I think it leads to defeat. So we need to think in different ways. I also think that one of the lessons we also need to learn and perhaps draw lessons from, one of the experiences we should draw lessons from, is the reality that there has been a lot of external interference in Africa. And a lot of that external interference has fueled conflict in many African countries, has fueled instability, has supported opposition groups against liberation fighters, and so on. You know the history, perhaps better than myself. This is a reality. So in my view, while there may be concern about Wagner Group or Van Dijk, which is another security group which was in Mozambique, there's also a concern about countries that have mineral interests in African countries and are there as a destabilizing force. So I think we need to look at the full plethora of problems that give rise to insecurity, bad governance, and the absence of democracy on the African continent. It's not a one-country problem. It's a world phenomenon which results from Africa's rich mineral wealth that has made it a significant target of external players that don't always have the interests of Africa at heart.
So this was a very wise response by the South African Foreign Minister Pandor to comments by Antony Blinken, basically saying Russia's Wagner Group is in Africa. You got to step up against Putin. And Linda Thomas Greenfield, the UN ambassador, threatening basically secondary sanctions on African nations if they conduct development deals with Russia. I assume there'll be threats about China as well. The head of Southcom has made similar threats in recent days. The U.S. is just sounding like a truly neo-colonialist nation on the world stage because of it's losing the African continent to China, and Russia is sort of involved, maybe more peripherally involved in security stuff and some infrastructure. But what is she referring to? I mean, she is referring to the history of the U.S. supporting not just apartheid South Africa, the Inkatha Freedom Brigade, which was the Afrikaners kind of proxy, which it used to attack the ANC. It was basically like the way the Palestinian Authority has been used to crush Palestinian resistance. This was a black organization backed by the Afrikaner government, I think with CIA assistance. We also saw the U.S. support with weapons, the colonial Namibian government against the resistance movement there. You saw the U.S. support against SWAPO. So the South African government against SWAPO. You saw the U.S. come into Angola to support the right-wing forces against the MPLA liberation movement, which was supported by Fidel Castro's Cuban military. You saw the U.S. and Israel help provide apartheid South Africa with nuclear technology. And before that, you saw the U.S. and its CIA operative Frank Carlucci participate alongside the Belgian former colonial master's intelligence service in devising Operation Timberlake to kill Patrice Lumumba, who may have been the greatest African leader who was seeking to unite the continent into a giant union and prevent the theft of its resources, and do something similar to what Hugo Chavez did in South America with the ALBA system. So Lumumba was assassinated and replaced with Mobutu Sese Seko, one of the worst dictators on the African continent, setting the stage for the killing in the resource wars in Congo that have left more people dead than at any point since the genocide of World War II. That's what she's referring to. And this is what the US is sort of stepping into with all of its arrogance. This is the Biden administration that presents itself as progressive on racial issues to America, treating Africa as a neo-colonial tool.
Absolutely. I've never seen such a polite way of telling someone to fuck off. I mean, it was really, really impressive. And I guess, and to be a diplomat, that's the kind of, especially a diplomat in the global South, where you have to deal with the U.S. and risk its wrath constantly. You have to find careful ways of telling them to go away. And it's an amazing moment. And it speaks to, obviously there are people in power right now who are very desperate. And their answer so far is to double down with more threats, more weapons to Ukraine. We'll see how that goes. I mean, ultimately, it's the people who will suffer. And you and Mark Swoboda talked about this, is Europe will be feeling this in ways it hasn't felt in generations, with rationing of energy being most likely if this continues going into next year.